Welcome to the MIM Podcast. I'm Adam Norman, founder and CEO at MIM, where we're on a mission to create the best major incident managers in the world. At MIM, our clients range from the largest, most well-known companies through to new, innovative companies across almost every industry from more than 72 different countries. You're going to hear about the best practices, strategies and tactics, how companies deliver major incident management excellence, some of the challenges they face, and different views on major incident management from around the world, as well as how major incident management is constantly evolving. On this podcast, we go deeper, interviewing professionals from the community. Our hope is that you will leave this podcast with some new ideas and a greater passion for major incident performance. In this episode, I sit down with Julie Gunderson and Ryan Garett from PagerDuty. PagerDuty is a major incident response tool. We discuss the major incident industry, present and future, as well as how and why people choose PagerDuty for their major incident response. We hope you enjoy the show. Hello, Julie, Ryan, how are you both doing?
Hey, I'm doing very well. Thanks for having us on board.
Yeah, excited to be here and almost be done with 2020.
yeah. Let's see how 2021 does. So you're both from PagerDuty, who lots of the community will know. Some might not be familiar. We've actually spent some time together before doing the podcast, but it'd be really nice if you could both introduce yourselves to people who don't know you. Julie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Julie Gunderson. I'm a DevOps advocate here at PagerDuty. I've been at PagerDuty since April of 2019. And prior to coming here, I actually worked for a managed services provider and worked with customers going through some major journeys and transformation to the cloud, and also worked with 3 of the major cloud providers to help customers be ready for those environments. Ryan?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So Ryan Garett, I'm actually a principal solutions consultant with PagerDuty. I've been here for 3 years now. Well, it's time flies. It's hard to imagine 3 years and kind of the evolution of the platform in that time. Before PagerDuty, I actually spent some time at some other software vendors. Spent several years at IBM, and the last little bit working at IBM, kind of working in the event management space, working with the Omnibus platform. So been working with some of these large customers. Oh, and kind of the other piece of that is here at PagerDuty, I actually work with some of our large customers, typically large financial institutions across North America.
So brilliant, thank you. So really interesting. So obviously, PagerDuty, very interesting software company, doing some great things in this space. But it's interesting that both of you actually come from the community as well. So you very much kind of understand the environment we're in, which isn't always the case. So very excited to talk to you both. Thank you. So I guess my first question, and obviously, I know it very well, particularly through customers that we work with. PagerDuty is in with a lot of major companies, but could you tell people who aren't familiar to surface level what PagerDuty does and essentially why you guys would come on the Major Incident Podcast and talk about it?
Yeah, sure. I'll take this one. So really, PagerDuty is a platform to automate the incident response process. In that major incident management process, there's a lot of manual steps that typically happen. So, getting people involved, getting the right teams, spinning up conference bridges, trying to look at graphs, trying to, engage other stakeholders. And that's really where PagerDuty comes in to help automate those processes and reduce a lot of those manual steps that happen throughout the major incident management process, automate them, and kind of shorten that whole process that it takes to, identify something, see it as a major incident, go through the process of engaging all those teams and really drive that to a much shorter time for resolution.
Brilliant, thank you. So essentially a purpose-built tool, very, very powerful for major incident operations within teams, what sorts of companies do you tend to work with? Do you work with smaller companies, larger companies, everyone?
Well, yeah, I think this is kind of the beauty of the platform with PagerDuty is we work with those, really, forward-looking, really advanced companies that are in, like the Silicon Valley companies, the Netflixes, the Ubers of the world. But also, we actually have a lot of value for a lot of those other customers that are not as, headquartered in Silicon Valley and that are around the world. And so I actually spend a lot of my time working with financial institutions. And so we see kind of the gambit from a very small company into, the world's largest companies. And also along that spectrum of, companies that are, 100% cloud native, but also companies that are very much, the other 99% of the companies that exist that aren't 100% cloud, that all have these really complex operating environments that really have all of the complex processes and toolings that go in there, and we end up adding a lot of value at both ends of those spectrums.
Yeah, I mean, I can absolutely see it's really interesting, isn't it? We've talked about this a bit offline about there seems to be, particularly when you start getting to the niche of major incident management, two very distinct categories of company, and they seem to approach it very differently. And you've got those more heritage companies that have been around a very long time. Typically, they're pretty substantial in size. So talking about the financial sector, we talk about retail banks, and often because of legacy systems and the amount of change, there's going to be really high volumes of major incidents. And naturally, they almost have small armies of major incident managers all around the world, whereas with some of the more modern companies that are leveraging cloud-based technology, the infrastructure is a lot more nimble, and the focus seems to be more on building really resilient systems without single points of failure or planning ahead so that the tech essentially doesn't become an issue, that perhaps have different practices and don't necessarily have armies of major incident managers. But you tend to find with some of those as well that product-led as well, the uptime just is the reputation. And I think in the heritage companies, the older ones, not all major incidents are customer-facing, whereas in these newer companies, most of those are going to be pretty substantial and very much direct revenue impacting incidents. So I think it's a really interesting split of these two types of companies. So it must be really interesting. You must get to know these companies really well because you're implementing a solution that's right at the heart of what they're doing in some of the worst mission critical outages.
We do. I mean, we get to talk to them when they are. Sometimes they'll come to us because something major has happened, something headline breaking, and they've realized that they need to change the way they work, or we're trying to prevent that. Either way, you kind of get to know the dirty little secrets, for lack of a better way to put it, on how things are working and not working within the organization. So that's one of the reasons that I'll come in and talk to customers, that Ryan will bring me into is we talk about the cultural transformation, because with any sort of change, it's not just implementing a tool, but you have to think about the people behind it and how they adopt that. So we get to see organizations from multiple different angles, from the culture to the tooling. And Ryan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think this is actually really interesting. Spending most of my time with these kind of large financials, one of the things I always do is kind of walk me through your current process. What does that look like? And every single time that we do that with these massive kind of large financials, what we see over and over again is there's a defined process, and then there's the actual process. And sometimes, in more often cases than not, those are actually very different. And in almost all of those cases, what we're seeing is it is the collective effort of a lot of manual processes and a lot of intuition and a lot of tribal knowledge that is really steering these customers through these major incident processes. And so as much as we've evolved in technology and we've evolved in that, I have seen a lot of these, massive companies have still very much and rely on, these very manual processes to shepherd them through that major incident.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So, I mean, I've got quite a few questions off the back of that, but in terms of the kind of two different styles of company that we've talked about, do you find that there's much difference in when you engage? Are there any core things that really stand out when they're dealing with major incidents?
I'm going to start off by saying that regardless of the type of company, every company thinks they're unique going through this journey, and that their problem nobody has ever seen before, and it's just their organization. And more often than not, we see the same types of issues over and over again, and that's whether or not you're digital native or you've got a whole bunch of legacy systems. The same types of problems occur. And Ryan brought up, manual processes. And I love to talk about processes just in the fact that, one of the things that we see is processes owning the company versus the company or the people owning the processes. So we'd see that a little bit. I would say a little bit more with those digital natives. They tend to review their processes more often and make sure that they make sense and that they're the right things, versus the older companies who tend to really want to hold on to these things because they use the phrase, this is how we've always done things. And that we consider one of the most dangerous phrases that you can say, right?
Yeah, and just to extend on that, I would say that's probably the most fundamental difference I've seen in those different types of customers is in kind of these I call them the unicorns, as Julie's kind of riding a bit of a unicorn, right? They have much less historical pieces, whether that be infrastructure, whether that be processes. And so kind of they're able to kind of take a look at things and say, hey, this isn't quite working. We're going to refine this and we're going to keep refining. And that idea of kind of that continuous improvement. And I see the other side of that with kind of these other kind of, larger companies that have had, have been around for 100 years and they've been doing business for 100 years, and they've really developed, these processes that work across, and I find that it's actually sometimes it's hard to even convince people that it might be worthwhile to change a process because it's worked for so many years, and it's kept these institutions going and manage that, and I think that's probably that kind of the thing that I probably would say would see between those two companies is that really desire to continually refine and the pace at which that can be done is I think very different on those two sides.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting. I guess that would probably echo what we see. I'd suggest managed service providers are a bit different in that I think they obviously. Most of the large players are very long established, but they too, I think, really focus on process almost over everything. And they've normally got a process that's pretty damn good. They're probably not, unless they've necessarily worked with us or a company like yourselves, they're probably not focused too much on how the tools are being utilized to do all the heavy lifting for their people. And also, they've been squeezed, I think, by pricing. Managed service providers like lots, I think, have been pushed down by customers, particularly in the major instance space. It's almost an afterthought. And so you don't necessarily see them always have the required budgets that they perhaps should for such critical function. I think that's changing a lot. I mean, we've worked with a few real key players and done some global transformation for them recently. But we always talk about this starting at the solution stage when they're engaging with customers, so they know up front. Yes, there are things you can cut costs on, but major incident just shouldn't be one of them, or you're not going to get the white glove service that you want and expect when something really goes wrong. So it's interesting. I think there's a bit of a shift in attitude towards it. but it's definitely too slow for my liking. But so, by the way, some people do just listen to this on audio. So Julie is not actually riding a unicorn, for anyone that is just listening. She's not saying.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
She's not riding. She is wearing a really smart PagerDuty T-shirt with Pagey, who is the PagerDuty mascot. Anyone who works with PagerDuty will probably know this. But it's a very cool top that Julie's wearing. So yeah, she's not actually on a unicorn. So okay, that's really interesting. Do you? So I will try, because I know what you guys do and I know this space really well. I will try not to skim over certain things. And so for me, you look at companies like PagerDuty and what you do for an operation, and I think it's incredible. It's really, really powerful. In particular, in our global best practice, we say that the first phase of your process in major incidents is the initial 15 minutes. And that's because when you have a slick, robust process, your people are well trained, the operation knows what it needs to do, and you are leveraging the right tools and technology, getting your first comms out within 15 minutes of a major incident is more than achievable. And that's something we work really hard on companies doing. And so when I look at something like PagerDuty, it's such a quick, positive impact you can have on your mean time to engage, mobilizing the operation. It's the first thing is getting everybody who needs to be involved. And obviously there's a lot more to it, but I know a lot of people who watch the podcast will be really interested in that one particular thing. So I don't suppose you have any numbers on kind of mean time to engage for people when they first come to you, so prior to an implementation of PagerDuty versus once they're actually using it, it's embedded in the operation, and how quickly they're able to transform the mobilization. Do you have any kind of numbers on that?
Yeah, well, and a couple things I'll note to that is one of these other kind of subtle nuances that we see in a major incident management process is the very traditional approach is, I don't know who we need, so let's get everybody. And so we're going to get, we talk to these big companies, and again, a lot of large banks I spend time with, and we're going to get 50 people on a call, we're going to get 100 people on a call, and it's the first question is, okay, like how many of those people, who of those people are the ones that you need? And it's typically 4, 5, 6 people that are really the kind of the subject matter experts to be able to engage on that. And so that's one of the first things that we work on. It's even before the concept of, how fast can we get people engaged, is who are the right people that should be engaged and how can we get them engaged? And then the next piece is like, okay, how can we get them engaged faster? Now, we actually did an analysis with IDC a little bit earlier this year, and they saw through their research, again, this is kind of third-party research here, that they were actually seeing over a 70% reduction in the time it takes to over an 80% reduction in the time it takes to identify an issue, and over a 70% reduction in the time it takes to troubleshoot those issues. So those are pretty substantial impacts that we're seeing for customers. And I'll share with you one of the customers that I'm working with now is after a PagerDuty, and some of their teams are seeing a sub 1 minute engagement of many of their resources.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So when you say to troubleshoot, you mean actually mean time to resolution, yeah? So actually to resolve major incidents.
Correct.
Wow, okay, that's pretty phenomenal. I mean, that's if you're, particularly for larger companies, you're mobilizing, like you say, 50. It's not uncommon that we engage with companies and they'll talk about having 100 people on a call, and I'm kind of head in hands, that's the last thing you need to be doing. But so that's a real cost. So for you guys to reduce that by a significant amount, that's incredible. That's money saved in different areas.
Well, and that, I think that's actually one of the core values we see with PagerDuty, is actually to be able to streamline that process. So if you were to think about having 100 people sitting on a call, waiting for John or Jane to come in and say, yeah, I've checked the logs, here's where we're at. That's a really expensive business problem. That's not a technical problem, because you start to look at those and you say, of those 100 people, how many of them could and maybe should be doing something else that is productive for the company. Whether that's engaging with the customer, whether that's adding new feature functionality, but in place of that, they're actually kind of sitting there waiting for something to happen. And so that the number of people that get involved in an issue, and I'll say an issue because it may be an issue before it becomes a major incident, is actually a really critical point. And that's where you start to think about, relying on automation and relying on, a platform like PagerDuty to be able to, facilitate that whole process of streamlining those people, right? And it's not to say that maybe those other, maybe 4 or 5 people, that other 95 people don't have some stake, and they may be important to receive communication and updates and absolutely on what's going on with that particular issue. But that can be done, ad hoc or in real time, and providing them with data where they don't have to sit on a conference call to be able to kind of get those little tidbits that they may need.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about it being a business problem, and it's really a people problem. If you are waking up in the middle of the night, 100 people, what does that do to them? And then the impacts of that on retention, on burnout rates. So as you both mentioned, it's costly in so many ways. I mean, you've already got a major incident going on that could be costing your organization publicly, but then that internal cost is something important to look at. And, we still see organizations that are looking through spreadsheets to try to find the right people to call. And you mentioned getting those comms out within the first 15 minutes. Well, if you don't know who to call within that first 15 minutes, how can you get those comms out? Because comms that are that serve no purpose, there's no point in getting those out in 15 minutes if there's no actual value to that. So reducing that toil on the people is important. And we do see this. I've got some screenshots of just all these hundreds of little squares now, right? When really, I don't know, any more than 8 to 9 people sometimes on a call, that's more than enough to get there. But then at the same time, are people comfortable acknowledging? Are people comfortable with the ability to be able to escalate? And that's one of the things that we say here over and over and over again is never hesitate to escalate, because you don't need 100 people on the call right away. It is important to understand within any organization that you can get the right person on the call when you need them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think, again, what you see with the difference in those two splits of companies, so more traditional companies that have been going a long time, large major incident functions, you'll typically see those major incident managers running solo, meaning a major incident manager running it, supporting and leading a group of technical experts and SMEs, versus, let's say, more modern or younger companies who perhaps do prescribe to having someone else handle comms for them, for example. So very different terminology as well. We talked about this offline, but so you have like an incident commander who essentially is leading those people. Often in more modern companies, they have a bit more technical expertise. They may even be a technical expert, and they may have someone doing communication for them. What I think is really interesting for the older, very large companies is if you are running this major incident manager model who's running solo, PagerDuty almost does double the heavy lifting for that major incident manager. If that one person is crafting all of the comms that are going out, they are also, as you mentioned, trying to find who needs to be engaged for this. All of that is time. And so for me, they almost get double the win, perhaps from the other types of companies, in terms of engagement, because you've got one person trying to handle all of that. And that's probably a model we see more often. So you almost look at that and go, well, okay, the value of having a tool like PagerDuty in there is almost doubled. So it's really interesting. I don't suppose you have an average downtime cost to the types of companies you engage with?
This one is probably one of the hardest.
Too varies?
It is. It is such a varies, because I mean the size and shapes of customers, and even experiencing this with customers. on how different teams within these massive customers measure downtime. And I think this is one of those, like, it's fairly challenging with customers because, and sometimes they don't necessarily want to air maybe their dirty laundry, for example, and how much these type of processes are costing those. But if you were to think about, pick your stereotypical bank, pick whatever flavor you like there. But if you look at some of those core applications that are the prime moneymakers for those customers, they are measuring impact to that business in the hundreds of thousands of dollars plus range per minute. And so you start to look at this and say, the simple example, you have a massive trading organization that is executing trades in real time, and those positions of those trades change. And so if they make a position and a purchase, and for whatever reason, for a technical reason, they're not able to execute that purchase, and that stock price changes. And by the time that they get that back in there, that could be potentially millions of dollars of impact. That is, and it's kind of hard to measure that because it's like, well, did we lose money? Were we, like, all those kind of things? But, in that case, you may have lost a very important trading position that could represent millions of dollars to the business. Now, in other areas outside of the financial as well, we see this as in, when you measure downtime, you also measure things like SLA penalties and fines, and like, think of like an airline, right? Where if they're not able to meet their the stated times of a departing plane or arriving plane, there's SLAs that go with that. So those minutes of downtime really are quite varied, but are very impactful to the business. At the end of the day, and even if you were to think about this and start to look and say, okay, like let's say for argument's sake that we could all agree on a cost for the business, then you start to say, okay, what is the people cost as well that goes with that? Because if you're now running a major incident with 100 people that's involved, and now you're burning those people out, again, that's another dimension of that downtime that doesn't always get accounted for.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting that you say it. Yeah, it's also, if that's overnight, some of those people aren't going to be there in the morning doing their regular job, even if you've resolved it. So, yeah, I mean, there's projects that you've got underway, there's project deadlines that have been missed, there's a cost to that. You may have contracts if you're a large organization. But that's really interesting. Sorry, Julie?
No, it goes back to, again, having the right things in place so you're getting the right people at the right time. I mean, and it everything just really kind of boils down to that very simple statement of orchestration and automation, because every organization is different in the cost that they measure. Some measure cost impacting on how many people and the salaries involved with how many people were interrupted and whatnot. There's the organizational and reputational damage. There's the financial cost. There's so many costs with downtime. And I mean, there was a major cellular carrier that had 8 hours of downtime in July, and the FCC got involved. So we look at it differently based on the organization, but the underlying problems are still the same, kind of no matter what organization you're in.
I find that really interesting, and typically the same, particularly some of the same types of organizations. There's very few challenges that they're facing that we haven't already seen, but everyone feels that it's completely unique to their organization. Which is what's really interesting. Some of it's just got a slightly different nuance to it. But it's really interesting to hear you say that, because one of the things I find, even very mature, quite sophisticated major incident functions in operations, I'm yet to come across one that I think is accurately calculating their downtime. The same reasons that you've mentioned, they've missed half the things that you would add on and look at to that. So even companies that have a reasonable grasp, but one of the most interesting things I find is that companies typically haven't worked with the business to really try and get that number. And it's almost because they've never done it before. And there are unique challenges. For example, if you are like a large managed service provider, your customers may not want you to necessarily know that, because then you perhaps realize just how valuable the service you're providing was. But also it's confidential information. But even when the IT operation works directly for the end user organization, most of those don't have a relationship with the business where they fully quantify the downtime. And I've always found that really, really interesting. And I see it as something that's going to have to change. I don't see how you can move away from that. Particularly, there's been a shift in the last 2 years. Major incident functions are getting larger budgets, and we've been trying to support companies in how they do that and the structure for it, because most of them never had to do that before. And so it's really interesting to me that I think because it's quite painful and can be quite an uncomfortable conversation, and it takes constant hard work.
Yeah, and I would agree with you there on a few points. So I agree. I think we're seeing kind of a shift with investment of major incident management. Training people, up leveling their skill sets. One of the things I think is driving that is people are starting to kind of recognize and saying, this has a major impact to our business. And even if we can't quite quantify what that looks like, I've literally been in meetings with very senior executives at large organizations that kind of did this and said, this is what we think it is, because of it's so complex to actually calculate what that true impact is. But we're starting to see these, kind of the outside effect as well, is we recognize that there's a cost, but also we're getting these, when we go down, and especially public facing ones, we're now kind of getting a double whammy, because we're getting, the initial downtime, but we're also now getting all the negative press and the negative impact and the brand impact, and all of these pieces that now are going to different lines of business to have to deal with. And when you start to look at like a CEO and their plan, and a lot of that is around one of kind of three things, right? How can we increase our revenue? So that's adding new customers or adding new functionality, decreasing our cost or reducing our risk. And those are the kind, you boil that down and you start to think about the impact of major incidents that have on all of those three categories, right? You're trying to, acquire new customers for whatever that is, and people see your name, on Twitter or wherever else as being a unstable platform. Well, maybe I go and take my money elsewhere. Maybe I go and take my service, go and get service elsewhere. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing, and at least in my opinion, on how or why that major incident management function is now being up leveled in a lot of cases with these large companies.
100% agree with that. I mean, customers are going to let you know via social media if there is an issue, and they're going to let everybody else know. And as I mentioned, large outages are their front page news, and consumers have been trained. I have been trained. You have been trained to expect always on. I mean, a regular consumer out there isn't going to say, I want 100% uptime, but we've been trained to expect that. And we did a study in, I think a 2018 survey, UK. I can't remember exactly what year. Regardless, we found that 66.8% of consumers said that they would completely abandon a product after 1 minute of the non-responsiveness, of the spinny little circle. And that's where consumers have become more demanding and more vocal.
Yeah.
And ultimately, we want to keep them happy, right? We want to focus on that customer. And that's just, as you were mentioning, you've got comms, you've got your internal comms, but you've got your external communications. And that's another thing that I'm very vocal about. Organizations sometimes do tend to try to hide that they're having an outage. And I should not have to go to Down Detector to get confirmation that a service that I'm relying on is down. And we don't even have to say outage. Outage might not be the right word, but a major disruption.
It could be degradation, could be,
that getting those communications out and being organized in the way that an organization tackles these. And that's key. You can either have chaos, which is just going to make an incident worse, or you can have an organized approach. And I think that's what, we get at with major incident management, with our incident response process. It's about reducing that chaos and that toil that comes with the actual chaos of an incident.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's still a people sport, meaning you're still very much reliant on people around it. But absolutely, if you haven't got all the bits that can be automated and a structured process that everybody understands, we're just adding more potential opportunity for things to go wrong or take longer, more complexity and stress for your operational teams, which makes very little sense. But that's okay. So really interesting. Tell me a bit more about, so we've talked about mobilizing, but tell me a bit more about the comms piece that PagerDuty really helps people take care of. How does it help people when they're running major incidents?
Maybe I'll take a first pass at this, Julie, and then if you want to add. So that process of comms is actually kind of a multifaceted approach, I think. So people just don't look at email anymore. In fact, I'd probably argue most people don't look at email, or they ignore many of them, or they create filters in their inbox that filter them off, and they ignore a lot of that. So that comms channel, I think, is kind of one aspect of a really important piece. And if you start to think about, moving to a more real-time state, an email that you got an hour ago on the status of a major incident is probably outdated. And so what, where we're looking at focused at PagerDuty is really engaging and communicating with people where they work and where that makes sense for them. So it's not just an email. It's, some people prefer it on text. Some people prefer engaging on a mobile device. Some people like looking at a web status page. Some people like engaging and seeing things in Slack and Microsoft Teams. And so if you were to think about the manual process to be able to go and do that, and you want to communicate with those people across those different mediums, that's a lot of copying and pasting, right? That's a lot of, trying to drop stuff in and, put it into an email template and fire this off. And most people don't read those emails. And then, we're going to send them a text, and we're going to do that in a different system. And we're going to do this in a different system. And then, we want a different type of communication for our technical people versus our, executives, right? So there's a very different communication stream that goes with that. And, some of that may be over Zoom, for example, or other communication mechanisms that you're getting on and having a video chat. And so really what we see with PagerDuty with that approach for communication is automating that process. So automating the process of engaging people across multiple mediums and across ways where they want to make sense, giving them the ability to take an action as part of that. So not just a blast notification, hey, we're having an issue, but hey, if we need your help, here's some buttons where you can take an action, maybe from your mobile device. And then also kind of the last piece of that is switching this to a more real-time model of engaging your people, right? Again, the traditional path in the major incident management is, at every certain interval, we're going to send out an email, we're going to send out a blast. And, in a real-time world where things are changing in such a real-time pace, that becomes outdated very quickly. And so the idea there is, how can we provide them with that information that they need, and give it to them in a much more real-time state, and give it to them on the path that makes sense for them.
I mean, so this is really interesting. So Julie, you mentioned about how impatient we are as consumers. And of course we are now. We've got next day delivery with Amazon. So even in the physical world, we're impatient. I know I used to think of myself as really patient, but now, like, if my mobile provider, if something's not working for 10 minutes, I'm struggling. I'm trying to get something done. It's a frustration. And definitely, I think it's interesting. Again, when we met and spoke offline, I was saying I still think it very much depends on the brand and what they are providing to their customers, because we have really different expectations. If you're a mobile or you're involved in telco, people's patience for there being a problem is very limited. It's just not great. And yeah, if you're a platform of some kind that people depend on to get things done, again, even a couple of minutes, it's a real frustration for people. So it's really interesting, I think, to play that game. I talked about defects with cars, and we talk about this in the training of somebody like a BMW or a Mercedes versus a Volvo buyer, and if they were pushed to not be able to make a purchase in a couple of months for a company car, perhaps with certain brands, they would substitute it with another premium brand. Whereas I think with other types of brands, the psychology of that particular buyer, they may stick with it. So what I think is really interesting when you get into that the psychology of the buyer and the consumer, it changes. But I think one thing's true, and it really resonated, you said, is we're really impatient, but also you can't hide this anymore. There's nowhere to hide. The world is just too open. And so if I'm a consumer or a commercial client of somebody and I find out about the issue from anyone other than them, that's a problem for me. More so than there being a problem, to be fair. And it's a real shock that particularly certain well-established companies still do this. And they think, oh, people won't notice. Like, no, everyone notices. And yeah, people are pretty vocal, some perhaps unfairly so, but that's the world we live in. Social media gets lit up and people are pretty verbal in a virtual world. And so, yeah, it's really interesting that some companies still try to do that instead of just being as open and transparent as possible. But I think that goes into the legacy of this industry in that, I've talked about a lot, particularly with speakers at the MIM Expo. So this was the second year we previously ran it, the MIM Expo, in November. And just to get those people to speak, even now, some of them had to really work hard with their comms or PR department, get senior sign-off, and we work with them. And I think there's been a legacy of just saying, no, this can't be talked about outside the company, which goes to some way as to why you might see that kind of behavior ingrained there, because people are so used to being told, no, we don't talk about this. But it's definitely more damaging than being more open and transparent.
It 100% is. And you're right. It goes back to those, do your processes own you? Or do you own your processes and do they make sense now? But we've been talking a lot about like external communication. One of the things that is incredibly important is internal communication, and we call it stakeholder communication here at PagerDuty. So you can subscribe to receive communication, and stakeholder comms are really important because they will reduce the chaos on a major incident call. Because come on, executives will hop on. And they will say, I want information. I want it now. Stop what you're doing. Get me a list of affected customers, whatever it is. We have a little term for it. It's called executive swoop and poop here at PagerDuty. But that is a direct result of your stakeholders, of your internal folks not being informed of what's going on during an incident as well. And that just makes it that much worse. And so when you think about notifying your internal teams, you want to provide those proactive updates like regarding the status of a major incident, because it gives that more consistent understanding of the current incident and that broader real-time awareness, and it allows for the more consistency with those incident narratives that you are sharing externally, right? And so that reduces that chaos within an organization, even for those folks that are not on a call. So I think that it's also really important to not just think about the external communications, but also how are you talking to your folks internally? Like, we're very, very open with what we do here at PagerDuty. We have an incident war room that anybody can join. Anybody can actually join the incident call. They should just join it quietly if they have nothing to contribute to the resolution of that. But the war room, anybody can go in and look for the updates as to what's going on in that incident. So keeping your organization informed is key. You don't want a salesperson going out there trying to demo something when maybe the environment is down and they're demoing to one of their biggest clients,
You were saying about the stakeholder piece, and I think it's really interesting that I talk about this a lot. There's some common challenges that pop up, and I'm going to borrow your term, that swoop and poop. I think that's brilliant. All of that manifests in loads of different ways across the three phases, but predominantly it all stems from confidence. And when you talk about extreme ownership, if you're a major incident manager or on your terms an incident commander, stakeholder management and their confidence is completely down to you. And if you don't get that right and consistent, even if it's good, it's not consistent, they feel that there's nervousness, and particularly people of the personality types of particularly DEF dominance within the DISC framework that we talk about, which you find a lot of senior executives tend to lean towards. There seems to be a bias of whether that's why they're successful or it's just a byproduct. So those people are probably going to be quite dominant. They come in, they're used to fixing things, they understand the commercials, but typically they're not really contributing to anything meaningful in terms of resolution. You can see technical people pulled away from the call for one-on-one chats, particularly if they have good relationships with senior leadership. And it all just extends the time. And it's really interesting because one of the things you see, even if the rest of a major instance managed well, is if you don't nail the initial internal comms well, even if you do a good job throughout, you still tend to see stakeholder interference in a less than positive way. Whereas obviously, and that can happen the other way around. You can get the start right and perhaps lose control of something, and people feel and see that. And so we talk about major incident managers not just thinking about resolving a major incident. And I think it was ITIL, and it's been seen elsewhere. It used to be resolving a major incident as quickly as possible via workaround or resolution. Well, in version 3 of our framework and what we teach, we've added in whilst maintaining stakeholder confidence. And that sounds like such a minor change, but actually it's a whole fundamental concept of you rethinking what your job is. You're not purely there just to run the incident. You are there to maintain stakeholder confidence, which in turn feeds back into the major incident. So I think it's a really important point that you make, really, really important. And I think something that's quite underrated and not always understood in the context that it should. Sometimes people feel that senior leadership are perhaps interfering or being difficult. Well, actually, it's probably, if you're the person running the major, it's probably your fault, and you need to take ownership, and there are ways that you can deal with that.
They're not trying to be disruptive. They're not trying to demoralize people on a call. It's a failure to notify them so that they have to come in and ask for information. And so we always want to look at do we have the information disseminated widely? So going back to your framework, right? It's great to have a framework. But if your organization, if your SLT, if people are not bought into this and aware of this, again, it just crumbles the whole thing. So you kind of talked about it a little bit earlier when we were trying to figure out how much an incident costs, right? People really do operate in silos within organizations, and that's another problem. So that's why having that communication sent out widely, having your framework known and understood of what the process is when these things occur is really important.
So for people who haven't used PagerDuty, what else can be done? What else can they do with PagerDuty that's really going to help them run major incidents?
Well, actually, so one of the key things I think you start to think about is, we talked about PagerDuty, being able to, do a lot of those steps that, involve major incident management teams, and we can automate that process. You start to think about the next pieces of that. Well, what else can we automate? And this is actually, I think, a key area where we see PagerDuty, evolving as an organization, but continuing to add additional value with things like with the acquisition of our Rundeck partner. And I understand you're going to be talking with Damon here very soon. But you start to think about, what are the pieces that go on to an incident? What are the pieces that go into a major incident that are not just people related? So potentially those are system related. That could be simple as, hey, every time this type of incident comes in, we had somebody to go run these 10 commands to go get bits of information so we can determine, is this a major incident or not? Well, those are really types of things that really we should be automating, right? Those are, repetitive tasks that, somebody has to run and somebody has to know how to run. If you think about, okay, I need to get a SME to get involved because they're the only ones that know the 10 magic commands to get us that. With the addition with Rundeck here as well is, let's just automate that process. So now your teams are looking at more information. They're looking at more relevant information as part of that major incident. Now, you can start to take it to the next level, right? Is what else can we automate it? So if part of your troubleshooting steps are, let's say, whenever something like this happens, we just restart the service. That's a very simple thing. I hear that a lot. Cool. Let's give you the tools to automate that process. Maybe the first steps is we want to put this in the hands of the responders and the major incident team to make that decision and make that simple so that they don't have to wake a SME up to go run this, simple thing. Does this fix the problem? And then you start to think about kind of the next level and kind of where, customers are really striving towards is to more of that, automated. And I'll throw in a lovely term here, self-healing. I hear that a lot, but I think it's just a really fancy term for automation. But, automating next bits of that as well. So maybe that restarting the service happens before we engage a bunch of people and try to, troubleshoot that. And so I think there's a huge value in that increasing of automation. The next piece I think really we see is just the data piece as well, is how can we track these things, day over day, week over week, month over month, so that we know that we're improving? How can we identify things? How can we identify incidents that kind of plague our team over and over again? Like maybe we want to go and be a little bit more proactive. And so instead of them waiting to become a major incident and getting everybody in that, maybe we can go and make some adjustments to head that off earlier. So we can start to maybe engage people earlier. Maybe we will need to go and fix something in the code of that application that's causing that. But ultimately, we want to be a little bit more proactive. And then the next piece here is how can we leverage machine learning to help us with that those tasks? And that's, where have we seen an incident like this before? How did we solve that before? So instead of every single time an incident that comes in, people are, okay, this is net new to us, right? Or, Julie, she's really good. She dealt with this last week. Julie, how did you solve this last week, right? Like, how can we automate that process so when people start to get involved, they're a lot more informed. They have a lot more context. We've automated some of those steps. So now we can use those really important resources to actually use, their gray matter and think about how we can solve the problem, as opposed to, okay, I just need to run this command, I need to run that command, I need to run this command, and really kind of work towards solving the problem. So those are three areas where I think PagerDuty really augments a major incident response process. And actually, I would even argue is, help you avoid that major incident process, because we can get people earlier involved so that they can resolve that potentially before it becomes a major issue or major incident that involves multiple teams and all of these things. So if 2 or 3 people can solve that, and it's really quick for them to solve that with the tools and the data that's in the automation that's in PagerDuty, you might never see that as a major incident.
Yeah, and how are you learning? Taking these things, and that's what Ryan's talking about, learning from your incidents, right? You'll hear me do a lot of talks on postmortems and how do we learn from our incidents, and also postmortem your major incident response process. Make sure that the process worked. But we have intelligent dashboards, right, that can spotlight the percentage of high escalations or unactionable incidents. Like if you have unactionable incidents, let's go figure out how do we need to tune our systems, and how many repeat incidents there are in a hail. You could, in a service, you can look at the service health and the team performance. So there's all of these extra piece is a lot of people still think of PagerDuty as the pager. You're getting notified of an incident, right? Which is where we started, and that was great. But it's beyond that now, and this is about your operational readiness and health. And then how do you take all of these incidents that you've had and learn from them, automate what you can, self-heal. So there's a lot more than just even the orchestration piece, which is diving deeper after the incident has occurred.
It's really interesting. And congratulations on the acquisition, by the way. I know everyone's excited there. But yeah, of course, it's PagerDuty and a lot of the tools that created specifically for major incident functions. It really is quite impressive the speed and capabilities they can give an organization. You mentioned the stats earlier, very interesting. And the post-major incident reviews, being able to look back on those, be able to produce those fairly quickly and easily from a centralized tool like PagerDuty, I think is really valuable to a lot of companies. We've been trying to drive companies to take them a bit more seriously, easier and more modern, smaller companies, bigger companies. In my experience, telco and the financial sector are pretty good for this, but everyone else seems to almost just play lip service. Going back to what you said, Julie, about kind of a slave to your own process of we just do post-major incident reviews for anything that's particularly messy, it gets sent off. That's pretty much it. We don't learn from that. We're not embedding it. We're not really doing anything off the back of it, which kind of puts you to the point of, well, why do it then? You need to be doing it for a function and a reason. It needs to be adding value, or why add to the time. But with the acquisition, it's really interesting, and I was quite excited by this because I see where you're going. PagerDuty, obviously already a very, very good tool for people running major incidents. But as you mentioned, simplifying things that typically happen over and over again, whether that's restarting services, whether it's doing diagnostics, and having something like that available to teams and operations, I think is the next logical step in certainly the tool section of major incident management. And I think it will completely change the way companies deal with major incidents. You can see immediately, can't you, see a further reduction in staff required. You haven't got those single points of failure in your most skilled technical people. They're not going to be at risk of burnout, as you mentioned before. The speed of essentially doing a health check when you first believe you've got a major incident, if that has been built in and scripted, that there is a button essentially to do that, I mean, that's incredible. And I know anyone watching this will probably be very excited by that. I mean, I'm kind of stealing the vision here. It's obviously what you guys are doing, and Damon obviously is coming on the show. But it's really impressive, the vision you guys have for that and what's going to be possible.
Yeah, and I would actually add one dimension to that, which is a lot of times it's missed. It's this idea of what would that individual be doing if they were not on that major incident call. And this is every customer I deal with is, we're being pushed to go faster. We're being pushed to innovate faster. But if you think about all of these really smart minds that you have inside of a company that are being pulled into this, that has a huge impact on that speed to innovation. And so the other dimension I would add back here is when you start to automate these things and you start to tax those SMEs less, and it's not that their need for their position or their expertise goes away, but how can you refocus that expertise to benefit your business? How can you refocus those SMEs to give them more time back in the day to build innovation, to build feature functions for your customers, to go drive additional business value? And we see this a lot where, these companies are like, hey, we have a transformation process, we have a maturity program or a cloud migration program, whatever we want to call it there. But the same people that are doing that really important innovation or transformation work are the same people that they're relying on over and over again to help, resolve kind of day-to-day things. And so we see this actually as being almost like a force multiplier to say, yeah, we're going to kind of automate this process, but we're going to free those resources up on the other end to help your company innovate faster. And that's probably one of the key metrics that I see a lot of these, even larger organizations, they're starting to try to measure and capture the speed of innovation. And they have, different metrics in which they do that, but ultimately they're trying to figure out how to increase that pace so that they can deliver more value to their customers faster.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah. So very interesting. And yeah, something else we see is people struggling with the budget splits are very much echoing what you're saying about kind of supporting what we have now versus the future. And you can see, particularly if you're a CIO or you sit on the C-suite, you can see people very aware that in the fast-paced economy we're now in, you've got to keep pace or someone's going to come along and do it better, quicker and faster. So no, that resonates. That makes a lot of sense. Perhaps even more so for larger, longer established companies, because it's hard to, if you've got thousands of employees, it's hard to move very fast. If you've got a smaller, more nimble team, at least in my experience, it's from corporate world back into running companies, it's much easier with a smaller team to change direction, to move very quickly. So really interesting. So you talked about some of the other tools earlier, what you see people using. So normally when we have guests on the show, I always ask what their major incident tool stack looks like. Obviously with you guys, are there any other tools that you see teams using when they deal with major incidents? Any common ones that fit in with PagerDuty that you see constantly? Any that you think are better than others?
Well, that's an interesting way to phrase that.
So forget so I'm probably putting you on the spot. Forget the better than others. What are the most common ones that you see people using that are still effective?
Well, so for at least me and the customers I deal with, the vast majority of the customers are all using ServiceNow as their main incident management tool. And ServiceNow is a really great incident management tool. But if you think about all of those things that we talked about, automating that response and automating those pieces, that's really what PagerDuty is purpose-built for. So a lot of our customers, we really see the value of adding PagerDuty to an existing tool set that includes ServiceNow, because we have such a strong integration. We're in production in kind of these world's largest organizations with that integration, to enable customers to automate a lot of those response process while maintaining that link into that core event management or incident management tool that the organization has kind of blessed and kind of gone forward with. And so that's kind of one really interesting point that I see is it's not a competitive space there. It's a enhance and improve to provide that. And the simple example for that is like a new tool set, for example. You want to bring in a new tool set or a new process, and we see really when you start looking at more decentralized teams that are working on this cloud transformation or cloud migration or what other fancy term that we want to talk about it. A lot of times they're using tools when that may not be the same tools that the corporation is using. So they're using maybe more specialized DevOps tool sets or more specialized, CI/CD type tools. And this is a really good way for PagerDuty kind of to help broker those different processes and workflows and really make sure that you have that consistent, source and data in ServiceNow, but also having a lot of those automated steps, automate that process. So now you kind of get, a more improved process, but obviously actually a more streamlined data source as well, and improving that process. So that's kind of one of the areas I see. And then kind of the other areas is just if you start to think about, a different way of thinking around change, right? If we talk a lot about major incident, but it's very closely related to change and change management. You look at the ITIL framework, usually the first question that people ask in any major incident is what's changed? And PagerDuty, I think, has a really unique approach to being able to incorporate change events and link them to incidents. And I say that it's very different than a change window. And I use my terminology very specifically there. But a change window may be 3, 4, 5 hours. A change event may be a single moment in time. And so being able to integrate with like a CI/CD type tool chain to be able to take a change event, this is exactly when a change occurred, and then bring that and link that into an incident. And so you think about that as a major incident, and somebody that's coming in and looking at this, and right at their fingertips, they see the last few changes that potentially may have had an impact. And so your responders now go, okay, like, game on, right? Like, this is where we need to go. And if you think about, all of that time spent potentially in a major incident, a good chunk of that is trying to figure out where the problem is, right? And so if we start to be able to shine that light and say, maybe this is an area that we want to investigate first, without having to go and do a manual lookup in an email or a spreadsheet or whatever other tool that a change management tool, and layer that data in directly with the team, I see there's a huge value there. So you're thinking about PagerDuty interacting with an core incident management team like ServiceNow, but also some of these other tool sets like a CI/CD tool sets that may not make it directly into ServiceNow or may have another process to do that. But in the moment where you need that information as quick as you can, there's a ton of value there.
That's really interesting. So even I mentioned some of the more mature companies have been doing major incident management and to a very good standard for a long time. You still hit one of their biggest challenges is change. And you can see ITIL's great as a framework. I think all the frameworks, including our own, are just that, though. I think the danger people run into, and you see people faltering, is where they use it as a full-on blueprint, and there's nothing outside of that could possibly be created. One of the things we're seeing is because of going back to what you mentioned about the speed of innovation and companies making such significant and frequent change within the environment, the old model of change just doesn't seem to work for companies. And that's anecdotally from clients we deal with. But it's one of the most common things is our change process just is broken with major incidents. And we just can't keep pace. It's not keeping control. The cost of it is getting out of hand. But you are seeing, I know telco in particular, Andrew Jelly from Telefonica, who heads up major incidents, who was on the other week. He's just taken on change as well. And that's something I've seen across quite a few of our clients recently. People who are heading major incident functions in traditional companies are getting given change. And I think it makes a lot of sense for the same person to have the oversight, because suddenly everyone's aligned to the right thing. So it's really interesting you mentioned that. And I imagine for companies who do not have that visibility of change events, pretty powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, like if we were to go back in time, an accelerated change timeline was once a quarter, right? And we would make a very significant change that would represent hundreds or thousands of overall change. And maybe we do that once a quarter. And then the change kind of started to go and with the pace of innovation, now the pressure is like, okay, we can't wait to provide all these new feature functions for a customer. And so we started to do that more frequently. And then customers are like, oh, well, we'll do it on a monthly basis, and we'll do it, and then it's a weekly basis. And now I would actually see the evolution of that is change on demand. And so that's not a frequent, like, it's not like I must change X number of times a day. It's like, we have a process in place to enable us to make a change when it makes sense for us and for the business. So if that's like, I need to fix something right away for a customer, by all means, like we have a process in place. If that's like, I want to add new feature functionality and I want to add that today because it's ready today, I should be able to do that and release on demand. And if you look at that through that lens of that traditional change management, where it would go to a cab, and they would do this assessment, trying to imagine that, many times a day, this cab meeting, like there would just be an endless cab meeting that they would have to deal with. Right.
And if you're doing that properly, you've got SMEs who are able to assess those technical, which is a huge drain. And sorry, I interrupted.
No, and that's that whole point, right? Is all those same people that you need to assess that impact are the same people that are sitting in those CAB meetings. So how do you, again, go back to enabling that speed of innovation? And that change is actually a really important piece to be able to link back in and say, yes, there's got to be a change process in place. And there's certain criteria, right? Maybe high risk change, maybe they go to a more formal process. Maybe lower risk changes, maybe there's an automated process that we can put in place. And that's, and then an automated process. Okay, we're automating, again, back to my previous comments about let's automate as much as we possibly can. When we automate that process for change, as much as we automate and we can test and we can make an assessment, sometimes things don't go as planned, and that's how outages occur. And so you kind of take that full link back and say, great, we kind of have to put some guardrails in place here, but if and when like a change has a negative impact, we also need to be able to remediate that as fast as possible. And so being able to clearly link potential changes to incidents it's just this mind-blowing side of it where you're just like, even that process, potentially that's an hour for people to take a look and say, what's changed and do we need to investigate that? And that's, I think, a huge area where PagerDuty has invested in and continues to invest in to support these adjacent tool sets that are really our customers are kind of jumping in full force to kind of address these challenges that they have within their own business.
So I mean, really important, and something we hear echoed a lot. So let's pull back a second. So, Julie, when you think about the industry, think about the community and all the people and different types of companies you engage with, where do you see specifically major incident management headed? What do you think the future holds for the industry?
I mean, I think that the industry is going to get smarter. I think we're going to get more to a preventative model. We talk about that with operational maturity. Are you reactive? Are you proactive? Are you preventative? The goal is to get to that preventative model. I know that, some organizations can have hundreds of major incidents in a week. Definitely see that number going down as we and our systems get smarter and more reliable. So I do think that it's an ever-evolving process, and that's the important thing to understand, is to constantly review your process, your major incident management. I think it is going to be a continued focus. As we talked a little bit about offline, this was something that kind of wasn't talked about very much, wasn't budgeted for, it was just kind of like this, they just kind of did that. Major incident management is something that is absolutely front and center now. This is a core piece of the business, and I think that is just going to continue to gain importance. As much as we want to be 100% preventative, incidents are going to happen, systems are going to fail, and it's all about how we handle those situations when they occur. And customers, we're not going to get any less demanding. If anything, we're getting more demanding, right? I mean, I can now see where my Amazon package is, if it's around the corner or, about to be at my house, but that's what we're being trained to be. And so as consumers become more demanding, major incident management is going to be more important because it's the reality of where we're at.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think very interesting that you talk about the proactive versus the reactive. I think you see certain activities taking place, and this continual service improvement, but properly done for major incident management, is the reason we created the MIM stakeholder experience, which is a way of getting the whole team involved instead of, say, major incident process owner or the head of the team being the one to drive it. That you get the voice of your operational major incident managers, you get the voice of your technical resolving groups, your leadership teams, all the people, all the stakeholders who are recipients of that. because it's really interesting. It almost feels like because people weren't quite sure how to do it, they often didn't. So you look at every other area of an IT operation, they work really hard and quite effectively at continual improvement. When it comes to major incident, you don't feel, or at least I still don't feel it's anywhere near given the same attention. But you're absolutely right. The overall, the function is getting more visibility. And I think social media in part has a big part to play with that. Companies' reputations are everywhere, which is good in a way. I think we're moving away from the here's a reasonable budget. Now there has been a major incident, whereas previously you were struggling. I think people are thinking about it ahead of time now instead of the same perhaps knee-jerk that cybersecurity sometimes gets. They wait till they have a massive outage, it's very public, then suddenly budgets open. I think companies are getting much more proactive. I think you're right. But it's going to be really interesting. I think the very distinct difference between how the older companies who have thousands and thousands of staff over it talked about how they do major incidents, where perhaps they have hundreds of major incidents, versus more modern companies who I think the distance between those and how both of them operate is going to close quite substantially. I think there's some really good stuff to be learned from both sides that they'll start to incorporate. And one of the things is interesting. I also think the reason this didn't get much attention is there wasn't really a community. And I think in part because key frameworks perhaps didn't give it the attention it deserved, yet companies have been doing it for decades. I think the same people who were blueprinting frameworks into organizations and operations didn't really know what to do with it, so they left it, and you only had experience of the companies you've been at. I think having a community now, having events like the stuff PagerDuty does, PagerDuty Summits, and also has a really good community, which we'll plug at the end of this so people know where to go if they want to engage with, because you do your own podcast, push it to the limit, and also have some really good resources for people. But I think everything done in this space in terms of bringing community together, getting professionals talking openly about what we all know happens, there's no point pretending it doesn't, is also going to be a major catalyst for it getting the attention it needs within operations, because it's far easier for me, if I'm head of service management at a large company, to go back into my CIO and go, look, this is how this company's doing it. People are putting the resource, the focus on it. If there's lots of media around it, if there are talks that I can go and listen to, learn from, and embed that in my own organization. So I think it's really important, the community side. And I think actually that will drive a lot of the commercial stuff that happens. So I think it's really important. So thank you for coming on the show as well, because I think that in itself is really quite powerful. And what you guys do in your own space is really good. So, Ryan, what do you think about the future of the industry? Do you have any other take on it?
Yeah, I kind of see this to your point is we've kind of diverged different processes here in we have a very centralized process, and we have some decentralized process, and I actually start to see, to your point, is kind of those starts to come together. There's some really important pieces and learning pieces on each of those. And I do see, major incident is becoming more prevalent, and companies are investing in it because it's such a high, the outcome is such a high visibility and high impact to the customer. Now, I also see, essentially, we start to look at, how do you have a blend between a centralized and a decentralized process? And I think one thing specifically for the major incident process I would see is a slight decentralization of that. Instead of you having a major incident management team that does the entire company, maybe pulling some of those really good major incident management skill sets closer to those application teams and augment those skill sets that, the people that know that application really, really well. And, they kind of start to get more embedded on that as well. And I used to spend a number of years in the Army, and that was a really good way that they did that. It was kind of this kind of cross-pollination where we would embed other functionality into units to augment that. And I think that is likely to happen here because, just if you start to think about, okay, speed, innovation, those are now really key things. And having those kind of smaller units being able to solve some of those problems potentially faster with more automation, I think is a really, really interesting value prop for customers as they start to look at that major incident management function as an entire whole.
Brilliant. Okay. So in terms of PagerDuty as a company, where are you guys headed specifically across like the next 3 years, next 5 years?
Well, so here's an interesting point of that. I think, broadly speaking, you'll see more automation. So I mentioned the acquisition of Rundeck, right? So we're trying to find ways for us to help our customers automate. And that may be, parts of a major incident function, that may be part of even just simple like data collection, right? Like, let's take those tasks that are very manual and potentially painful for an organization if they're done incorrectly. Let's automate those processes. So I'd say that's kind of our number one piece. The second piece I would say is just increasing the type of data and the accessibility of data for our customers to be able to see. So we've invested quite heavily in analytics. We've invested quite heavily in simple things like reports and being able for customers to be able to see that, and also being able to extract some of that data via our API. So I would consider an increase there as well, and being able to offer that back to our customers. And again, the idea here is, great. It's great you have a major incident process, but how do you improve that day over day? How do you improve, what you did last week, so that the organization doesn't go through that same process again? So maybe last week this same process took 2.5 hours. Maybe this week, how can we get that down to 2 hours? How can we get that down to 1.5 hours, et cetera? So I see an increase in data. And then the last piece where I see where we're going to be, where we continue to invest quite heavily as a company, is the increase of machine learning. So we've invested quite heavily in the concept of event analytics. Event intelligence is our terminology, but that's essentially using machine learning to kind of group things together, group incidents together that may be similar. But you start to think about, great, what else can we do with machine learning? How can we make recommendations to people to say, hey, we're seeing something here. Maybe we want to make a change. Maybe that change could be, maybe you want to automate this particular process or do that. So investing more heavily in that concept of machine learning, and it all kind of ties back into, how, if we have some really smart data scientists, and we have a really good data set that's, I would argue, is fairly unique to PagerDuty. How can we leverage that to go the other way and go help increase that automation, right? So I see really those as three kind of tenets to kind of PagerDuty's growth and increased success with customers kind of from every size, from the very smallest customers to the very largest customers.
Brilliant. Thank you. Very interesting. So listen, thank you both ever so much for coming on the show. It's been really, really interesting. As I said, I think it's a pretty small ecosystem of major instant tool providers at the moment. But you guys are obviously doing a stellar job at really empowering operations. And anyone who's not using major incident specific tools, I definitely say you need to go and check out PagerDuty. So for people who aren't currently working with you and they want to know more about PagerDuty, where's the best place for them to start? Just PagerDuty.com? Should they be going to the community? Should they just be engaging with your solutions people to see more? Where would you recommend they go?
All of the above. So you go back to our model about kind of work where it makes sense for you. We actually have multiple ways that you can engage with us. PagerDuty.com, all that kind of stuff. But we have an awesome community team, and Julie's team does an amazing job of engaging with customers and talking about industry trends and patterns. We've got a YouTube channel. You want to go and learn a little bit about that. We have a lot of really great customers that have spoken on our behalf at numerous occasions, and there's YouTube videos of that. And then there's an opportunity that we, engage somebody like myself and my team to come and talk with you, and literally have that conversation about here's your struggles, here's the challenges, and we can have a very good conversation about how PagerDuty can come in and help augment that and automate that. So I would actually say whatever way makes sense for your listeners to engage, we have those pieces to engage, and I would encourage them to do that, and go and do their research, and go and talk to customers, and go and ask those questions, and go ask internally as well, and say, what are we going to do about this? And I would say PagerDuty becomes a really logical fit with an incredible business value for customers, when they're engaging with us, and kind of well down that path.
Brilliant, thank you. And Julie, where can they find the podcast?
Well, so we have community.pagerduty.com that's free and open to anybody to join. So you can find the podcast links to it on there. Or you can go to pageit2thelimit.com and listen to any of our podcasts where we talk to industry leaders about what it means to run software in production. And so it's really meant to be kind of a best practices. And then just to kind of add on to what Ryan said, we do have a free tier of PagerDuty if people are interested in just kind of dipping their toe in, testing it out. It doesn't have all of the functionality, but for people that are new to anything like this, it's a great place to try things out. We love talking to people at the community as well. One of the benefits of going to community.pagerduty.com is that you can talk to people that are not PagerDuty. Right? People that are using PagerDuty. And again, it goes back to those customers and being able to hear their stories as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think one of the things through the MIM Expo, you really see the reason the engagement's so good. So like in virtual events, the MIM Expo was virtual before COVID. So the first year we ran it was virtual because we know the geography of where most of these organizations sit, numbers, and knew that it would end up having to be multiple road shows and you'd never get like the whole community together. But what's really interesting is most virtual events, at least my experience has been both in our industry and out, places like the networking lounges, etc., are never that busy. We find ours is kind of heaving with people, having conversations with one another. And I think that's really symbolic of how keen people are to engage with someone who is not from their own organization, to hear about their story about how they're running major incidents. And there's a real appetite for people to meet with other companies. So that sounds great if people want to speak to people in both different industries. I think there is so much to be learned from the community engaging with one another, not necessarily us, but each other as well. I think it's really important. So thank you both ever so much. I've really enjoyed talking with you both. You've obviously told people where they can go if they're interested in learning about PagerDuty. As I say, if you're not using any kind of major install, the difference these tools make to your operation, the ability to engage, the data you can get from them, really, really important. Your communication, it's a vital piece. It's a reason we teach people that there are tools out there. In the global best practice, I think it's an absolutely vital piece. You are never going to be as effective as an operation as you could be, regardless of how good your people are, regardless how good your process is, even if you get the continual improvement right. If you are not leveraging the technology available to do the heavy lifting for you, you are really missing out. So thank you both very much, and hopefully I'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you. Great to chat with you.
Bye.
Have a great day.